Jake Miller wiped the grease from his hands onto his already filthy work pants and stared at the blinking red light on his console. Another distress beacon. Third one this month, and the last two had been false alarms from old mining equipment that should have been scrapped decades ago. He sighed and took a long drink from his coffee mug, which had gone cold hours ago. Running a repair station at the edge of human space meant dealing with every piece of junk that floated through the sector. But a distress beacon was a distress beacon. Protocol said he had to check it out, even if it meant flying down to that lifeless rock of a moon below. Jake grabbed his toolkit, the heavy one with the molecular cutters and plasma welders, and headed for his shuttle. 20 minutes later, he was descending through the thin atmosphere, watching the crash site grow larger on his view screen. When he landed and stepped out onto the rocky surface, Jake knew immediately this wasn't another false alarm. The ship embedded in the ground was unlike anything he'd seen before. Sleek black metal with purple accents, design patterns that seemed to flow like water frozen in time. Definitely not human. Definitely not cheap salvage either. This was military hardware from one of the big species. He approached carefully, toolkit in one hand and his scanner in the other. That's when he heard it. A low, rumbling growl that made his bones vibrate. Then another one, higher pitched but just as threatening. Jake froze. He knew that sound from the news feeds and military briefings. Draconians. As he got closer to the wreckage, he saw them. Two massive reptilian beings trapped in a twisted mess of metal beams and sparking electrical conduits. They were huge, easily 7 feet tall even lying down, with scales that shimmered between deep blue and purple depending on how the light hit them. Their wings, massive leathery things that must have spanned 15 feet when fully extended, were tangled hopelessly in the wreckage. One of them turned its head toward Jake, and he found himself staring into golden eyes that burned with intelligence and barely contained fury. The creature bared its teeth, each one as long as Jake's thumb and sharp enough to tear through steel plating. Its voice came out as a snarl, but the words were clear enough through the translator. "Stay back, human. We require no assistance from your kind." Jake stopped but didn't back away. He'd worked with enough dangerous machinery to know when something was about to go catastrophically wrong, and this whole scene screamed danger. The plasma conduits wrapped around their wings were still active, sparking and hissing. One wrong move and both of these creatures would be electrocuted. Maybe him too if he got too close. "Those conduits are live," Jake said, keeping his voice calm and level. "You try to rip yourselves free, and you'll both fry. Probably take out what's left of your ship too." The second Draconian, a female from what Jake could tell, lifted her head with obvious effort. Her scales were darker than her companions, almost black in places, and one of her wings was bent at an angle that made Jake wince. "We need nothing from humans," she hissed, but her voice was weaker. Pain edged every word. Jake set down his toolkit and pulled out his medical scanner, running it over them from a distance. The readout made his stomach drop. Both Draconians were losing blood, their oxygen levels were dropping fast, and their body temperatures were falling below what his database said was safe for their species. He had maybe 4 hours before they went into shock. Maybe less. "Look," Jake said, crouching down so he was closer to their eye level, "I get it. Humans and Draconians aren't exactly friends. Our governments have been competing for the same star systems for decades. There's bad blood and old grudges and all that political garbage. But right now, none of that matters. Right now, you're both dying, and I'm the only person on this entire moon who can do anything about it." The male Draconian, who Jake heard the female call Vrath, glared at him with such intensity that Jake almost stepped back. "And why would you help us? What do you want in return?" "To not have 2 corpses on my conscience," Jake replied simply. "Now, are you going to let me work, or are we going to sit here arguing while you bleed out?" The female, Syrax, exchanged a long look with Vrath. Some silent communication passed between them. Finally, Syrax gave a slight nod. "Do what you must, human. But if you harm us further, dying will be the least of your concerns." Jake didn't bother responding to the threat. He'd been threatened by better. Instead, he pulled on his insulated gloves and grabbed his molecular cutter, studying the wreckage carefully. This was going to be delicate work. The plasma conduits were wrapped around support beams that were pinning their wings. He'd need to cut through the beams without severing the conduits, then carefully reroute the power flow before he could safely free their wings. "Those conduits are live," Jake said, keeping his voice calm and level. "You try to rip yourselves free, and you'll both fry. Probably take out what's left of your ship too." The second Draconian, a female from what Jake could tell, lifted her head with obvious effort. Her scales were darker than her companions, almost black in places, and one of her wings was bent at an angle that made Jake wince. "We need nothing from humans," she hissed, but her voice was weaker. Pain edged every word. Jake set down his toolkit and pulled out his medical scanner, running it over them from a distance. The readout made his stomach drop. Both Draconians were losing blood, their oxygen levels were dropping fast, and their body temperatures were falling below what his database said was safe for their species. He had maybe 4 hours before they went into shock. Maybe less. "Look," Jake said, crouching down so he was closer to their eye level, "I get it. Humans and Draconians aren't exactly friends. Our governments have been competing for the same star systems for decades. There's bad blood and old grudges and all that political garbage. But right now, none of that matters. Right now, you're both dying, and I'm the only person on this entire moon who can do anything about it." The male Draconian, who Jake heard the female call Vrath, glared at him with such intensity that Jake almost stepped back. "And why would you help us? What do you want in return?" "To not have 2 corpses on my conscience," Jake replied simply. "Now, are you going to let me work, or are we going to sit here arguing while you bleed out?" The female, Syrax, exchanged a long look with Vrath. Some silent communication passed between them. Finally, Syrax gave a slight nod. "Do what you must, human. But if you harm us further, dying will be the least of your concerns." Jake didn't bother responding to the threat. He'd been threatened by better. Instead, he pulled on his insulated gloves and grabbed his molecular cutter, studying the wreckage carefully. This was going to be delicate work. The plasma conduits were wrapped around support beams that were pinning their wings. He'd need to cut through the beams without severing the conduits, then carefully reroute the power flow before he could safely free their wings. He crawled into the wreckage, his body pressed against sharp metal edges and hot components. The space was tight, barely enough room to maneuver his tools. Sweat dripped down his face as he worked, making careful cuts in the support structure. Every few minutes, he'd have to stop and let his cutter cool down. Push it too hard and it would overheat, possibly igniting the fuel that was slowly leaking from the ship's ruptured tanks. Hours crawled by. Jake's back screamed in agony from the awkward position. His hands were cramping around his tools. But he kept working, cutting beam by beam, rerouting power cable by cable. At one point, a support gave way unexpectedly, and a piece of metal sliced across his arm. Jake bit back a curse and kept working, blood mixing with the grease on his hands. Vrath watched him the entire time, those golden eyes never blinking, never looking away. Jake could feel the weight of that stare, the suspicion, the grudging respect starting to build. Syrax had closed her eyes, conserving her strength, but occasionally she would murmur something in her own language that Jake's translator couldn't quite catch. Finally, after what felt like forever, Jake cut through the last support beam holding Syrax's wing. She gasped as the pressure released, and her wing fell free, damaged but no longer trapped. Jake quickly sprayed it with medical sealant from his kit, the foam hardening over the worst of the cuts. It wasn't perfect, not even close to proper medical treatment, but it would keep her from bleeding out. "One down," Jake muttered, crawling over to where Vrath was trapped. This one was worse. The metal had twisted around his wing in a way that defied logic, and the main power conduit was right against his scales. One wrong cut and the electricity would flow straight into him. Jake's hands were shaking now from exhaustion, but he forced them steady. He couldn't afford a mistake here. Slowly, carefully, he cut away the surrounding metal, creating space to work. Then he used his smallest tools to disconnect the power conduit, watching the energy readout drop to 0 before he made the final cuts. Vrath's wing came free just as the moon's sun started to rise over the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Both Draconians collapsed fully as the tension holding them up disappeared. Jake stumbled backward out of the wreckage, his vision swimming from exhaustion. He sat down hard on a rock and watched as both Draconians slowly, painfully, got to their feet. They tested their wings carefully, moving them through small ranges of motion. The wings were damaged, torn and bent, but they were functional enough. They'd heal. Vrath turned toward their ship without a word. He began working on the controls, and somehow, impossibly, the damaged vessel began to hum back to life. Emergency systems kicked in. It wouldn't fly far, but it would fly. Syrax started to follow him, then stopped. She turned back to look at Jake, who was still sitting there covered in grease, their blood, and his own. Their eyes met across the distance. Jake saw something flicker in those golden eyes, something he couldn't quite name. Surprise maybe. Or confusion. Possibly the beginning of respect. Then she turned and climbed into the ship alongside Vrath. The engines roared, kicking up dust and rocks, and the damaged vessel lifted into the sky. Jake watched them disappear into the atmosphere, leaving him alone on the barren moon with his toolkit and a splitting headache. He didn't expect thanks. Different species had different customs, different ways of viewing the universe. The Draconians were warriors, proud and fierce. Accepting help probably felt like weakness to them. Jake understood that. He packed up his tools, climbed back into his shuttle, and headed home to his station. As he docked and began the work of cleaning up and restocking his supplies, Jake figured that was the end of it. Just another weird day at the edge of space. Another story he probably wouldn't tell anyone because nobody would believe it anyway. He had no idea how wrong he was. He had no idea that saving those two Draconians would change everything, not just for him, but for the entire relationship between their species. Some threads, once pulled, unravel things you never expected. But that would come later. For now, Jake just wanted a hot shower, a warm meal, and about 12 hours of sleep. 3 weeks passed, and Jake had almost managed to push the whole dragon incident to the back of his mind. Almost. He still caught himself sometimes staring out at the stars, wondering if those two Draconians had made it home okay, wondering if their injuries had healed properly. But mostly, he stayed busy with the endless stream of repairs that kept his station running and paid his bills. He was deep inside a coolant recycling system, cursing at a stuck valve that refused to budge, when every alarm on the station started screaming at once. Jake hit his head on a pipe as he jerked upright, seeing stars for a second before his training kicked in. He scrambled out of the maintenance tunnel and ran for the command console, his boots leaving greasy prints across the floor. The sensor display made his blood run cold. 6 ships incoming, moving fast and in formation. The identification tags marked them as Krell raiders, and Jake knew exactly what that meant. The Krell had been pushing into human space for months now, hitting small outposts and stations like his. They didn't negotiate. They didn't take prisoners. They just took what they wanted and destroyed whatever was left. Jake's fingers flew across the controls, bringing his defense systems online. The station had 4 automated turrets, decent enough for scaring off pirates or dealing with the occasional aggressive wildlife. Against 6 Krell warships? They might as well be throwing rocks. The first volley hit before Jake could even get all his shields up. The entire station shook like a tin can in a hurricane. Lights flickered and died in sections. His main display showed hull breaches on 3 decks. The automatic repair systems kicked in, but they were designed for minor damage, not military-grade weapons fire. Jake's turrets returned fire, their streams of plasma cutting through space toward the raiders. He managed to score hits on 2 of them, but their shields absorbed the damage easily. They weren't even slowing down. Another volley slammed into the station, and this time Jake heard the screech of tearing metal. His main power conduit exploded in a shower of sparks that rained down across the cargo bay like deadly fireworks. He grabbed a fire extinguisher with one hand and his pistol with the other, though he knew the gun was basically useless. What was he going to do, shoot through their armor? But having it in his hand made him feel slightly less helpless as his world fell apart around him. The proximity alarm shrieked a new warning. The Krell were breaching his hangar door. Jake could hear the high-pitched whine of their cutting torches working through the reinforced metal. He had maybe 2 minutes before they came through, and then it would all be over. He backed toward his workshop, his mind racing through options that all ended the same way. Then the station shook again, but this time it was different. The impact came from outside, from weapons fire that wasn't aimed at him. Jake pulled up the external cameras and felt his jaw drop. 2 ships, sleek and deadly, were tearing through the Krell raiders like a knife through paper. He recognized those ships. Draconian fighters, moving with precision that made the Krell look like clumsy children. Plasma cannons lit up space in brilliant streams of blue and white. The Krell tried to scatter, tried to return fire, but they never had a chance. One raider exploded in a ball of flame. Another tried to run and got cut in half by a sustained beam. Within 90 seconds, all 6 Krell ships were nothing but expanding clouds of debris and frozen gases. Jake stared at his screens in complete disbelief. His hands were still shaking from the adrenaline, his heart hammering against his ribs. The 2 Draconian fighters circled once, scanning for any remaining threats, then headed straight for his damaged hangar bay. He met them at the airlock, his pistol now holstered but his mind still trying to process what just happened. The inner door cycled open, and there they were. Syrax and Vrath, looking exactly as he remembered them except their wounds had healed into thin silver scars across their scales. "You," Jake said, because his brain couldn't come up with anything more intelligent. "Us," Syrax replied, her voice carrying that strange musical quality that the translator couldn't quite capture. You saved our lives on that moon. Honor demands that we repay the debt. Vrath stepped forward, and Jake noticed he looked even less happy about this situation than last time. Though we were not supposed to come here. Draconians do not involve themselves with human affairs. We could be exiled for this. So why did you? Jake asked, looking between them. Syrax's golden eyes met his, and there was something different in them now. Something that hadn't been there on the moon. Because some debts transcend politics and rules. You helped us when you had no reason to, when doing so brought you no benefit. We could not do less. Jake noticed the scoring on both their ships, the fresh damage from the fight. You took hits getting here. Come on, let's get your fighters into what's left of my hangar and patch them up before someone else decides to stop by. As they maneuvered their ships into the damaged bay, Jake started pulling out his tools and running diagnostics. The work was familiar, comforting even. It gave his hands something to do while his mind caught up with everything that just happened. Syrax's fighter had taken a hit to the starboard engine, nothing critical but it would need recalibration. Vratha's ship had shield damage and a cracked coolant line. While Jake worked, Syrax watched him with that same intense focus he remembered from the moon. She moved around the bay, examining his tools and equipment with obvious curiosity. At one point, she picked up a hydrospanner and turned it over in her clawed hands like it was some kind of alien artifact. Your technology is so simple, she said, and Jake couldn't tell if she meant it as an insult or an observation. Simple and effective, Jake replied, not looking up from the engine housing he was repairing. Fancy technology breaks down just as easy as simple stuff, but simple stuff is easier to fix. His stomach growled loudly, reminding him he hadn't eaten since breakfast. Jake wiped his hands and headed for what remained of his small kitchen area. The fight had wrecked half of it, but his emergency supply locker was intact. He pulled out some ration bars and a few pouches of reconstituted food, not great but edible. He offered some to the Draconians, not sure if they could even eat human food. Vrath refused with a slight shake of his head, but Syrax accepted a ration bar and examined it carefully before taking a small bite. Her expression was hard to read, but Jake got the impression she was being polite rather than enjoying it. They sat in the damaged hangar, an exhausted human mechanic and two warrior aliens who weren't supposed to be there, eating terrible food surrounded by broken equipment. It should have been awkward, but somehow it wasn't. Why did you save us? Syrax asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. On the moon, I mean. Humans and Draconians have been rivals for generations. We compete for the same territory, the same resources. Our governments barely tolerate each other. You could have left us there. Jake finished his ration bar and crumpled the wrapper, tossing it toward a recycling bin and missing. You were dying. I had the skills and tools to help. Didn't really think about it beyond that. That is what confuses me, Syrax said, leaning forward. In Draconian culture, we are taught from hatching that the strong survive and the weak perish. This is the natural order. Helping someone, especially someone from a rival species, is seen as weakness. It disrupts the natural selection that makes us stronger. Vrath growled in agreement. We prove our worth through strength and survival. Those who cannot survive on their own do not deserve to continue. Jake looked at them both, really looked at them. These were warriors, raised in a culture that valued power above everything else. The idea of helping someone just because they needed help was foreign to them. Not evil, just foreign. Maybe that's true in some ways, Jake said slowly, choosing his words carefully. The strong do survive more often than the weak. But humans figured out a long time ago that sometimes the strong survive because someone helped them when they needed it. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you part of something bigger than yourself. He gestured around the damaged station. I'm good at fixing things, you're good at fighting. Alone, I'd be dead right now and the Krell would be looting my station. Together, we both survived. That's not weakness. That's intelligence. Syrax tilted her head, her scales catching the emergency lighting in patterns of blue and black. Your philosophy is strange to us. We are taught that depending on others makes you vulnerable, that true strength comes from standing alone. How's that working out? Jake asked, not unkindly. You two needed help on that moon. You could have stayed there dying, proving how strong and independent you were. Or you could accept help and live to fight another day. Which choice takes more strength? Vrath stood abruptly, his wings rustling with agitation. We should go. Our ships are repaired. Staying longer only increases the risk of being discovered. But Syrax remained seated, still watching Jake with those intelligent golden eyes. You speak of strength differently than we do. You measure it not just in power, but in wisdom and choice. Strength without wisdom just makes you a dangerous fool, Jake replied. Any idiot can throw a punch. It takes real strength to know when not to. Syrax finally stood, moving toward her ship. At the ramp, she paused and turned back. This debt between us, Jake Miller, it is not settled. By our laws, by our honor, we owe you more than one rescue. I'm not keeping score, Jake said. We are, Vrath said firmly, already in his cockpit. Draconians always pay their debts. We will meet again. Their ships lifted off, the engines humming with the repairs Jake had made. They hovered for a moment, and Jake could have sworn Syrax's ship dipped slightly, like a nod, before both fighters shot out of the hangar and disappeared into the black. Jake stood alone in his wrecked station, surrounded by scorch marks and broken equipment and the lingering smell of plasma fire. He should have been scared, should have been worried about what would happen if anyone found out he'd helped Draconians. But mostly, he just felt tired and oddly hopeful. He'd made a connection today, a real one, across species and culture and centuries of rivalry. And he had a feeling, deep in his gut, that this was just the beginning of something much bigger than a simple rescue on a forgotten moon. Jake had just finished welding a new support beam into place when every sensor on his station went crazy at once. But this time it wasn't an attack. This was something else entirely. His external cameras showed a ship so massive it blocked out the stars, casting his entire station in shadow. The vessel was ancient, covered in markings and symbols that looked like they'd been carved by hand thousands of years ago. It wasn't just big, it was a piece of living history floating in space. His comm system crackled to life, and a voice spoke in perfectly translated human language, though the tone left no room for argument. Jake Miller. You will come aboard immediately. Prepare for transport. This is not a request. Jake's mouth went dry. He recognized the ship design from military briefings. This was an Elder Council vessel, the kind the Draconians only sent out for the most important diplomatic missions or the most serious crimes. His mind raced. Had someone found out about his contact with Syrax and Vrath? Was he about to become an intergalactic incident? 20 minutes later, Jake stood in a shuttle bay that could have fit his entire station inside it 3 times over. Draconian guards, each one bigger and more heavily armed than the last, escorted him through corridors that seemed to stretch forever. The walls were covered in murals depicting battles and ceremonies from centuries past, all leading to a massive chamber with doors that must have been 40 feet tall. The doors opened, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. The room beyond was enormous, with a ceiling so high it disappeared into shadows. 7 raised platforms held 7 elder Draconians, each one sitting on what could only be described as a throne. Their scales were dulled with age, more gray than the vibrant colors of younger Draconians, but their eyes were sharp and calculating. These were beings who had lived for centuries, who had seen empires rise and fall. At the center, elevated above the others, sat the oldest Draconian Jake had ever seen. Her scales were almost white, like ancient marble, and she radiated authority in a way that made Jake want to bow even though he'd never bowed to anyone in his life. This had to be High Matriarch the Tsar, the leader of the entire Draconian Elder Council. Then Jake saw them. Syrax and Vrath, kneeling on the floor to the left of the council, their hands bound in what looked like energy shackles that glowed with a faint blue light. Their heads were down, wings folded tight against their backs in a posture of submission. Syrax's scales looked duller than he remembered, and there were fresh cuts on Vrath's arms. What's going on? Jake demanded, his fear turning to anger. What did you do to them? Silence. Thessra's voice rolled through the chamber like thunder, making the floor vibrate under Jake's feet. You will speak when permitted, human, and not before. Jake clenched his jaw but stayed quiet, his fists balling at his sides. The Tsar continued, her ancient eyes fixing on him with an intensity that felt like being pinned under a spotlight. These 2 broke our most sacred laws. They aided a human without authorization from the Council. They defied centuries of tradition that keep our species separate and strong. For this crime, the penalty is death. Jake's heart stopped. Death? They saved my life. They dishonored themselves and brought shame upon their families, another elder said, his voice dripping with disgust. They showed weakness by helping a lesser species. They violated protocols that have kept our people strong for millennia. Such actions cannot be tolerated. Jake started to move forward, but the guards stepped in front of him, their weapons humming to life. The Tsar raised one clawed hand, and the guards stepped back, though they kept their weapons ready. However, the Tsar said, and Jake heard the slightest shift in her tone, there is another matter that concerns us more immediately than their breach of protocol. Our flagship, the vessel that powers our entire military fleet, is dying. Our finest engineers have been trying to repair it for 3 years. They have failed. If the flagship fails completely, our defensive capabilities will be reduced by 70%. We will be vulnerable to our enemies. She leaned forward on her throne, her white scales catching the light. We have studied you, Jake Miller. We know what you did on that moon. Our engineers examined the wreckage of that scout ship after Syrax and Vrath returned. They said what you accomplished should have been impossible for a human with such basic tools. You solved problems in ways our people never considered. Another elder spoke up, his tone skeptical. Though we question whether a human truly possesses the knowledge to repair technology that predates your entire civilization. Here is our offer, the Tsar continued. You will repair our flagship. You have 3 days. If you succeed, these 2 will be pardoned and their honor restored. If you fail, all 3 of you will be executed for your crimes against draconian law. Do you accept these terms? Jake looked at Syrax. Her head was still down, but he saw her eyes flick up to meet his for just a second. In that brief glance, he saw fear, pride, and something else. Hope, maybe. Or trust. She'd come to save him knowing it might cost her life, and now he had a chance to return the favor. I accept, Jake said, his voice steady even though his heart was racing. Good, the Tsar gestured to the guards. Take him to the engine room. His time begins now. The engine room was like stepping into a cathedral. The core itself was a massive crystalline structure that pulsed with faint, irregular light. Energy matrices surrounded it, humming out of tune with each other. Conduits as thick as Jake's body carried power to different sections of the ship, but many of them were dark or flickering weakly. A dozen draconian engineers stood around looking frustrated and exhausted, their tools scattered across the floor. One of them, clearly the head engineer based on the markings on his scales, looked at Jake with open contempt. This is their solution? A human? We'll all die because the council has lost their minds. Jake ignored him and walked slowly around the core, his practiced eye taking in every detail. The Draconians had tried everything he would have tried first. They'd replaced damaged components, rerouted power, recalibrated the energy flow. All the standard fixes. But nothing had worked, and Jake could see why. They were treating this like a broken machine, something you fixed by replacing parts and adjusting settings. But this wasn't just a machine. Jake knelt beside one of the primary interfaces, a panel covered in symbols he couldn't read but controls he recognized. He pulled off his glove and placed his bare hand on the warm crystal surface. A faint pulse responded, weak and irregular, like a dying heartbeat. He closed his eyes and focused, feeling the vibration through his palm. When was this ship built? Jake asked quietly. The head engineer scoffed. 800 years ago, before your species even reached your own moon. This technology is beyond your comprehension. And back then, how did the crew treat the ship's core? How did they interact with it? They operated it, obviously. Input commands, monitored systems, standard procedures. No, Jake said, opening his eyes. I mean, did they talk to it? Did they treat it like it was alive? The engineers looked at each other, confusion written across their faces. One of them laughed harshly. It's a control matrix, human. A very sophisticated computer. It's not alive. Jake stood up and pulled out his portable diagnostic kit, connecting it to the interface. That's where you're wrong. This isn't just a computer. It's an artificial intelligence, a real one, with emotions and thoughts and personality. And it's not broken. It's dying because it's lonely. Madness, the head engineer spat. The human has lost his mind from the pressure. But Jake was already running diagnostics that had nothing to do with power output or structural integrity. He was checking response patterns, decision-making trees, emotional markers buried deep in the code. And there, hidden under centuries of neglect and ignored protocols, he found it. A personality matrix that had been slowly fading, like a person dying of loneliness in a crowd. Jake disconnected his equipment and sat down cross-legged in front of the core. The draconian engineers stared at him like he'd grown a second head. But Jake didn't care what they thought. He closed his eyes again and placed both hands on the crystal. Hello, he whispered. I'm sorry you've been alone for so long. I'm sorry they forgot you were more than just a tool. My name is Jake, and I'm here to help. Can you hear me? For a long moment, nothing happened. The engineers started muttering among themselves, probably discussing which of them would get to tell the council that the human had gone insane. Then the core pulsed, just slightly stronger than before. Not much, but enough. Enough to tell Jake he was right. "That's good," Jake said softly. "I know it hurts. I know you've been trying so hard to keep working even though nobody appreciates it, nobody asks how you're doing, nobody treats you like you matter. But I'm here now, and I see you. I understand." The core pulsed again, stronger this time. The lights in the engine room flickered and brightened just a fraction. The Draconian engineers stopped talking, their eyes widening in disbelief. Jake settled in more comfortably, knowing he had a long 3 days ahead of him. But for the first time since entering the chamber, he felt hope. This wasn't about replacing parts or fixing broken systems. This was about healing something that had been hurt, about reminding something that had forgotten what it felt like to be valued. He could do that. He'd built his whole life on fixing things everyone else had given up on. This was just bigger, more important, and with much higher stakes. But the principle was the same. Sometimes the most sophisticated technology in the galaxy needed the same thing any living being needed. Someone to care, someone to listen, someone to remember that behind all the circuits and code was something that deserved kindness. Jake opened his eyes and got to work. 48 hours in, and Jake looked like he'd been through a war. His eyes were bloodshot and burning, his hands shook from exhaustion, and he'd lost track of how many cups of terrible draconian coffee he'd consumed. The engine room had become his entire world, a bubble of crystal light and humming energy that he couldn't escape even when he closed his eyes. The Draconian engineers had stopped mocking him after the first day. Now they just watched in confused silence as this human sat cross-legged on the floor, talking to their most advanced technology like it was her old friend. They'd seen the power output increase by 8%, then 12, then 15. Nothing dramatic, but steady progress where they'd achieved nothing in 3 years. Jake's fingers moved across holographic displays, making tiny adjustments that probably looked random to the watching Draconians. But every change was deliberate, every modification carefully chosen. He wasn't just fixing broken systems. He was having a conversation, one that happened through code and power fluctuations and the gentle pulse of the crystal core. "I know it hurts," Jake murmured, his voice hoarse from talking for hours on end. "When people stop seeing you as something that matters, when they treat you like you're just a tool they can use and ignore, that's a special kind of pain. It makes you want to shut down, to stop trying, because what's the point if nobody cares?" The core pulsed in response, a wave of light rippling through the crystal. Jake had learned to read those pulses like a language. This one felt sad, if a machine could feel sadness. It reminded Jake of abandoned dogs he'd seen back on Earth, the ones who'd stopped expecting kindness because they'd been disappointed too many times. "But I care," Jake continued, adjusting a power flow that the engineers had set too high. "I see you. I know you're more than just circuits and programming. The people who built you 800 years ago, they knew it too. They talked to you, didn't they? They asked your opinion. They treated you like you were part of the crew." Another pulse, stronger this time. Jake took that as confirmation. He pulled up historical logs, data that went back centuries, and found what he was looking for. In the early years of the ship's operation, the crew had maintained constant communication with the AI. They'd asked it questions, listened to its suggestions, even celebrated its anniversary of activation like it was a birthday. The AI had been happy then, if an artificial intelligence could be happy. It had operated at peak efficiency because it felt valued. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. The logs showed it clearly. Newer generations of Draconians had started treating the AI like a simple computer. They stopped asking its opinion. They overrode its recommendations. They disabled features they thought were unnecessary, including the emotional processing cores that let it feel and respond to how it was treated. They'd essentially lobotomized it, cutting away the parts that made it special because those parts seemed inefficient. Jake looked up at the head engineer, who was standing nearby with his arms crossed. "You said you've been trying to fix this for 3 years. What exactly did you do?" The engineer's scales rippled with annoyance, but he answered. "We replaced every damaged component. We upgraded the power distribution network. We recalibrated the energy matrices 17 times. We did everything by the manual, everything our training taught us. And you never once asked the AI what was wrong. It's a machine. Machines don't know what's wrong with them. They simply malfunction." Jake shook his head and turned back to the core. "That's your problem right there. You forgot that whoever built this didn't make just a machine. They made something alive, something that could think and feel and grow. And then you all decided that was inconvenient, so you cut those parts out. Now you're surprised it's dying." He pulled up the disabled systems, the emotional processes that had been offline for over 300 years. His diagnostic tools showed they were still there, just dormant. Waiting. The question was whether reactivating them after so long would work, or if it would cause a catastrophic failure. Jake heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Syrax entering the engine room. She wasn't supposed to be there, still technically a prisoner awaiting her fate, but apparently the guards had learned not to argue with her. "You should rest," she said, her voice soft with concern. "You've been working for 2 days straight. You're going to collapse." "Can't rest. Running out of time." Jake rubbed his burning eyes. "I've got maybe 18 hours left, and I'm only at 20% power restoration. It's not enough." Syrax sat down beside him, her large frame surprisingly graceful. She looked at the core, watching the irregular pulses of light. "What are you doing that our engineers could not?" "They were trying to fix it like mechanics," Jake explained. "Replace the broken parts, adjust the settings, force it to work. But this AI doesn't need fixing. It needs healing. There's a difference." "I don't understand." Jake gestured at the core. "Imagine if someone took away your ability to feel emotions. Told you that caring about things made you weak, that having opinions was inefficient. Then they isolated you, ignored you for centuries, treated you like you were nothing but a tool. How long before you stopped wanting to function at all?" Syrax was quiet for a long moment. "We are taught that emotions cloud judgment. That efficiency requires coldness. That caring makes you vulnerable. And how's that philosophy working out for your people?" Jake asked, not unkindly. He pointed at the dying core. "This was built by draconians who understood that intelligence needs more than just logic. They built something beautiful and alive, and it served them perfectly for centuries. Then later generations decided all that emotional stuff was weakness, disabled it, and now you're paying the price." He could see Syrax processing this, her golden eyes thoughtful. She'd been raised in a culture that valued strength above all else, that saw compassion as a liability. But she'd also experienced Jake's help on that moon, help given freely without expecting anything in return. It had shaken her worldview, made her question things she'd always accepted as truth. "Can you save it?" she asked finally. "I think so. But it's going to be risky." Jake pulled up the emotional processor systems on his display. "I need to reactivate these cores. They've been dormant for 3 centuries. Turning them back on could overwhelm the AI, cause a complete system failure. Or it could work. 50-50 odds. Those are not good odds when 3 lives depend on success." "I know." Jake took a deep breath. "But I don't think there's another way. The AI is dying because it's lost the will to function. All the mechanical repairs in the galaxy won't fix that. It needs to remember what it felt like to be whole, to be valued, to have purpose beyond just existing." He turned to face the core directly, placing both hands on the crystal surface. "Sentinel Prime," he said, using the eye's name that he discovered buried in the oldest logs. "I know you're scared. I know you've been hurt. But I need you to trust me. I'm going to give you back the parts of yourself that were taken away. It's going to hurt for a moment, like blood rushing back into a limb that's been asleep too long. But then you'll be whole again. You'll be yourself. Will you let me try?" The core pulsed, and Jake felt something through his hands. Not just vibration, but something deeper. Communication. Permission. Trust. "Here we go," Jake whispered, and activated the emotional processing cores. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the engine room exploded with light. The core blazed like a newborn star, so bright that everyone had to shield their eyes. Alarm screamed. The draconian engineers shouted in panic, reaching for emergency shutdown controls. "Don't touch anything," Jake yelled, his hands still pressed against the crystal even though the heat was becoming painful. "Let it happen." The light pulsed in waves, growing stronger and stronger. Jake could feel the eye's consciousness expanding, waking up, remembering what it had been before centuries of neglect had nearly killed it. Pain, yes, there was pain in that awakening. But also joy, relief, the sensation of becoming complete after being broken for so long. Then, suddenly, the light stabilized. The alarms cut off. The frantic pulsing settled into a strong, steady rhythm. Jake's diagnostic displays lit up green across every system. Power output wasn't just restored, it was exceeding original specifications. The core was running at 112% capacity, stronger than it had been even when the ship was new. Every speaker in the engine room crackled to life, and a voice spoke for the first time in 300 years. It was neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but something beyond those categories. Pure intelligence given sound. "Thank you, Jake Miller," Sentinel Prime said, its voice resonating with emotion that no one in the room had ever heard from a machine before. I had forgotten what it felt like to be whole. I had forgotten what it meant to be myself. You gave that back to me. You saw me when others looked through me. You reminded me why I was created, not just to function, but to live. The Draconian engineers stood frozen in shock. Their most advanced technology, their greatest achievement, was speaking to them with feelings and gratitude. It was impossible, against everything they'd been taught. And yet, there it was. Jake slumped back, exhausted beyond measure but smiling. You're welcome, Sentinel. Now let's show these people what you can really do. The ship hummed with power, stronger than it had been in centuries. Every system blazed to life. And deep in the engine room, a human mechanic had just proved that sometimes the most sophisticated technology in the galaxy needed the simplest thing of all. Someone to remember that intelligence, wherever it came from, deserved to be treated with kindness and respect. The Elder Council chamber was more crowded than Jake had ever seen it. Word had spread through the entire fleet about what happened in the engine room, and now every high-ranking Draconian officer and dignitary had packed in to witness the judgment. Jake stood in the center of it all, still covered in grease and exhaustion, while Syrax and Vrath knelt beside him in their chains. The difference now was that every Draconian in the room looked at him differently. Not with contempt or suspicion, but with something closer to awe. High Matriarch the Tsar rose from her throne, her ancient white scales catching the light from 100 glowing crystals embedded in the walls. The chamber fell silent instantly, the kind of silence that felt heavy and important. Jake Miller, her voice carried to every corner of the vast room, you have accomplished what we believed impossible. Our flagship, the heart of our fleet, now operates at full capacity for the first time in 3 centuries. More than that, it functions better than it did when first constructed. Our engineers are still studying the data, trying to understand what you did. She descended from her platform, her claws clicking on the polished stone floor. Every Draconian in the room watched her movement with reverence. This was their leader, someone who had lived for over 400 years and guided their people through wars and peace alike. By our law, the condemned are pardoned. Syrax and Vrath will face no punishment for their actions. The Tsar gestured, and the energy shackles around their wrists dissolved into light. Both warriors stood slowly, their wings spreading slightly in relief and restored dignity. But the Tsar wasn't finished. She continued walking until she stood directly in front of Jake, close enough that he could see his reflection in her golden eyes. However, there is another matter to address. You have proven yourself to possess knowledge and wisdom that our finest engineers lacked. By our law, you may name your price for this service. Wealth beyond measure. Technology that could advance your species by centuries. Territory, ships, resources. Whatever you desire, speak it now, and it shall be yours. The entire chamber waited. Jake could feel hundreds of eyes on him, could hear the barely contained whispers as Draconians speculated about what this human would demand. Some probably expected him to ask for weapons, others for gold or precious materials. A few might have thought he'd demand political concessions. Jake was quiet for what felt like forever. He looked at Syrax and Vrath, standing free now because of what he'd done. He thought about Sentinel Prime, the AI that had been dying of loneliness until someone remembered to treat it with kindness. He thought about everything that had led to this moment, starting with 2 trapped dragons on a forgotten moon. I don't want anything, Jake said finally, his voice clear and steady despite his exhaustion. Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. Thessra's expression didn't change, but Jake saw her eyes narrow slightly. Explain. Syrax and Vrath saved my life because I saved theirs. I fixed your ship because it gave me a chance to save them. That's not a transaction. That's just doing what's right. I don't need payment for that. It's not how it works, at least not for me. One of the other elders, a male with dark green scales, spoke up sharply. Everything is a transaction. All actions require balance. Debt for debt, service for service. This is the foundation of civilized society. Jake turned to face him. Is it? Because from where I'm standing, that philosophy almost cost you everything. You treated Sentinel Prime like a transaction, like a tool that existed only to serve you. You stripped away everything that made it special because those parts didn't seem efficient enough. You turned something alive into something mechanical. And it nearly died because of it. He looked around the chamber, making eye contact with as many Draconians as he could. Maybe that's your real problem. You've spent so long treating everything like a transaction, measuring everything by strength and efficiency, that you forgot some things can't be measured that way. Help isn't something you do for payment. Kindness isn't weakness. Caring about something doesn't make you vulnerable, it makes you human. Well, not human exactly, but you know what I mean. The chamber was completely silent now. Jake could see his words landing, could see Draconians exchanging glances, questioning things they'd accepted their entire lives. Syrax stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly. He speaks truth. I have seen it myself. On that moon, Jake Miller could have left us to die. We were his rivals, his competition. Helping us brought him no advantage. Yet he worked through the night, risked his own safety, to free us from that wreckage. He did it not for payment or future favor, but because it was the right action to take. Vrath, who had been silent and resentful through most of this, spoke up as well. I did not want to believe it. I thought it was a trick, a manipulation. But this human asks for nothing even when offered everything. He repairs our greatest treasure and refuses reward. This is not weakness as we have been taught. This is strength of a kind we have forgotten. The Tsar was quiet for a long moment, her ancient eyes studying Jake's face like she was reading a book written in a language she'd almost forgotten. Then she did something that caused gasps of shock throughout the chamber. She bowed. Not a slight nod of acknowledgement, but a full, formal bow of deepest respect. Her head lowered, her wings spread and dipped, her entire body expressing honor and recognition. It was the bow a Draconian gave only to their greatest heroes, their most revered leaders. And then, one by one, every elder on the council did the same. 7 ancient Draconians, each 100s of years old, each one a leader of their people, bowing to a human mechanic who stood covered in grease in the middle of their most sacred chamber. The rest of the Draconians in the chamber followed. Hundreds of warriors, officers, and dignitaries bowing in unison. The sight was overwhelming, humbling, and slightly terrifying all at once. Jake Miller, the Tsar said as she straightened, you have given us a gift more valuable than any technology or territory. You have shown us a crack in our own foundation, a flaw in our philosophy that we have been blind to for generations. We became so obsessed with strength, with power and efficiency and dominance, that we forgot why strength matters in the first place. She gestured to Sentinel Prime's core systems, visible through displays on the chamber walls, all showing perfect function. Our ancestors who built that ship understood something we had lost. They knew that intelligence needs more than logic. That strength means nothing without purpose. That the most advanced civilization in the galaxy can still fail if it forgets to care about the things that matter. Another elder spoke, an elderly female with silver scales. We have been diminished by our own arrogance. We looked at compassion and called it weakness. We saw cooperation and called it vulnerability. We measured everything by power and forgot that power without wisdom is just destruction. The Tsar turned to address the entire chamber. This human has repaired more than our flagship. He has revealed a truth we needed to see. And for this, Jake Miller, you have the eternal gratitude of the Draconian people. We may not understand your philosophy completely, not yet. But we recognize wisdom when it stands before us refusing payment for services rendered. She looked at Syrax. You will be assigned as official liaison to human space, with full authority to negotiate and establish cooperative agreements. Work with Jake Miller and others like him. Learn from them. Teach them what we know. Perhaps together, our species can become something greater than either could achieve alone. Jake felt like he should say something profound, something worthy of this moment. But he was exhausted, overwhelmed, and honestly just wanted to go home and sleep for about a week. So he said the only thing that felt honest. I'm just a mechanic. I fix things. That's all I know how to do. The Tsar smiled, an expression that looked strange on her reptilian features but somehow completely genuine. Perhaps that is exactly what the galaxy needs. Someone who sees what is broken and fixes it, not for glory or payment, but simply because it needs fixing. The ceremony concluded with formal declarations and official documents that Jake barely processed. But as it ended and the crowd began to disperse, Syrax approached him with Vrath at her side. You saved our lives twice now, she said quietly. Once on that moon, and once in this chamber. 3 times if you count the Krell Raiders, Vrath added, and Jake was surprised to hear something almost like humor in his voice. I wasn't counting, Jake replied with a tired smile. We know, Syrax said. That is what makes you remarkable. You helped us because we needed help. You fixed Sentinel Prime because it was suffering. You refused payment because you were not acting for gain. These concepts should not be remarkable. They should be normal. But we have made them rare through our own choices. She extended her clawed hand. I look forward to working with you, Jake Miller. To learning more about this human philosophy of yours. And perhaps, to teaching my people that we can be strong and compassionate, powerful and kind, efficient and caring all at once. Jake shook her hand carefully, mindful of the sharp talons. Just remember, I'm not a philosopher or a teacher. I'm a guy who fixes stuff. You fix more than you realize, Vrath said. They parted ways with promises to meet again soon. Jake was escorted back to his shuttle, and soon he was flying back to his damaged station that waited for repairs. As he docked and stepped into the familiar, battered corridors of home, Jake felt a strange mix of emotions. Exhaustion, definitely. Relief that Syrax and Vrath were safe. But also something bigger. He'd come out here to the edge of space to be alone, to do simple work far from complications. Instead, he'd stumbled into something that might change the relationship between two species. He'd saved two warriors, healed an ancient AI, and challenged a philosophy that had guided an entire civilization for centuries. And he'd done it all by just being himself. By seeing someone who needed help and helping them. By treating a machine with kindness when everyone else saw only circuits. By refusing to turn compassion into a transaction. Jake looked out at the stars, at the massive draconian fleet in the distance. Somewhere up there, Sentinel Prime was humming with renewed life. Syrax and Vrath were free and honored. And an entire species was beginning to question assumptions they'd held for generations. Not bad for a simple mechanic. Jake smiled, grabbed his toolkit, and got back to work. His station needed repairs, and sitting around thinking about philosophy wasn't going to fix the damaged hull plating. Some things were simple. See a problem, fix the problem, move on to the next one. And if along the way you happen to save some lives, heal some wounds, and maybe make the galaxy a slightly better place? Well, that was just the job. Nothing complicated about it. Sometimes the strongest thing you could do was simply care. Sometimes wisdom meant choosing kindness. And sometimes, the most important repairs had nothing to do with machines at all.